That's why Chris and Jan have different last names, even though they're family. Despite this background, I still struggle to understand. David continued with a bitter smile, you might not get it because you're skilled, but Chris came from a completely different industry with no real expertise. The man's youthful appearance serves as his secret weapon despite his advancing years. Before you came aboard, he would make grand proclamations about appealing to the younger crowd without any evidence to back it up. The seasoned executives would listen, assuming he knew what he was talking about. It becomes clear that having a peer around would challenge his position. Instead of earning qualifications or attending training, he took the easier path by eliminating his rivals. He believed his opinions would carry more weight as a result. Employees in their late 30s and 40s who held supervisory roles became his targets. Any noticeable behavior from them was met with harassment or false accusations. Those with a healthy sense of self-preservation had no choice but to resign. This has led to a workforce dominated by either the company president, who is older, or fresh-faced young staff just starting their careers. Now I understood the situation clearly. Chris was like a seasoned office bully, undermining his colleagues to maintain his status as the youngest one present. These underhanded tactics only became apparent when the victims were about to leave. I had mentioned this to the president, but he couldn't believe his own son would be so petty and jealous. The president dismissed the idea as unbelievable. The company's website boasted that John had built the business from the ground up, making it a fierce competitor in the industry. Jan couldn't comprehend Chris's mindset, which prioritized being the youngest over actual competence. However, I knew all too well what would happen if the situation was left unchecked. My previous employer failed because they ignored similar jealousy. I decided it was time to confront David directly. Executive Vice President David, what are your goals for this company? I asked. David looked puzzled. My goals? Well, I hope we can keep increasing our revenue and profits. The president's successor is also very capable, even though he's still a student. David's eyes seemed to plead with me to overlook Chris's harassment for the time being. Given David's long tenure, he probably didn't want to stir up trouble in a comfortable environment. Leaving the status quo behind was a bold move. During our conversation, I revealed to David something I hadn't mentioned even in my interview. Do you know why I changed jobs 3 times? I inquired. Fired, David nodded, acknowledging. Yes, you mentioned being forced out due to jealousy. While it was unfortunate, we've gained a talented individual because of it. Taking a deep breath, I continued, the reality is that those 3 companies no longer exist. They've split, dissolved, or filed for bankruptcy. They're no longer operating. Surprise. David's expression shifted. That can't be. When we conducted a background check, those companies were still thriving. If you have any doubts, I encourage you to check their websites now, I suggested. David promptly pulled out his smartphone and began searching. His face grew increasingly shocked with each passing moment. You're absolutely right. But how could this have happened? It's quite simple, I explained. The individuals who drove me out became more confident and repeated the same actions toward others. Imagine the consequences when that cycle continues. I spoke calmly yet firmly. A company cannot function without its people. If the people inside abandon it, the company cannot sustain itself. I continued to speak with David, whose expression had become serious. If this situation persists, the company will eventually face the same unfortunate outcome. Truthfully, Chris's harassment is minor compared to what I've endured in previous workplaces, but it's becoming a significant problem. Chris has pushed me to either lose my job or be demoted. If I resign, it would be a victory for Chris, and he's likely to repeat this behavior. The future outlook is not promising. Whether my words resonated with him or not, David fell silent for a moment before firmly nodding. I understand your perspective. I won't simply stand by and watch anymore. Sabotaging the company out of jealousy is no laughing matter. I felt relieved. With David on my side, we could take drastic measures if necessary. After consulting with him, I headed to HR with a lighter step to retrieve the resignation paperwork. Just before the negotiation, John appeared puzzled as Chris's son proudly declared he would handle it. What do you mean? This was supposed to be handled by Mark. I fired him yesterday, Chris's son stated proudly. John glared at him. It's fine, I can communicate in English as well. The only remaining step is to sign the contract. Here is a paraphrased version of the given text, maintaining the same length as the original. Why have you let him go? Didn't he review the negotiation documents? The top executives from the other company are arriving today. How will you manage without him? Chris, who thought it was just a formality, was stunned by John's outburst. He frantically flipped through the documents and discovered a crucial sentence he had overlooked. A look of concern spread across his face. An hour before the negotiation, I received a call. They already knew I wasn't there since the morning. The call meant Chris had been searching for a last-minute replacement, but of course, he hadn't found one. Despite John's constant reprimands, Chris still didn't understand. I answered the call with a faint yawn. What's the matter? I got the resignation paperwork from HR yesterday. I'll fill it out and send it in the next day or 2, but I'm taking paid leave today, so I'm not coming in. You don't need to resign, just come to the hotel right now. Chris's desperate voice made me chuckle. Executive Vice President, isn't this quite different from what you said yesterday? Didn't you boast that you didn't need me? I didn't know the contract would be an error, Chris stammered. I could imagine Chris turning pale. He must have just realized the contract was an error, a fact clearly stated in the negotiation documents. If he had been involved from the start and reviewed the documents, he would have known this. Our new client was a top-tier company from the Middle East with a highly nationalistic CEO. Now you can watch the second part by pressing share and more. Update 3. Coming from the Middle East with a highly nationalistic CEO, their official language was Arabic, and they only accepted documents in Arabic. In a globalized world, trying to do business solely in your native language is impractical. That's why we always conducted negotiations in English with foreign companies. Only the agent with authority would be involved, and top executives would stay in the background, appearing only at the end. Despite being a top-notch company with a desirable market, few international partnerships existed because many couldn't overcome this hurdle. However, I had made a good impression from the start by negotiating in Arabic. My specialty is speaking 7 languages, and telling a joke in Arabic is a piece of cake for me. If the negotiation suddenly changed and the top executive, who had been assured by their agent of our reliability, was only addressed in English, it would clearly be a disaster. The top executive would feel insulted, and the deal would fall through. The documents clearly stated everything. Chris's claim of ignorance was no excuse. I had already dismissed him, and now he was desperate. He accused me of fraud because I didn't list every skill on my resume. I couldn't help but laugh. Fraudulent hiring? Seriously? Not listing all my qualifications isn't fraud. Besides, I never claimed to only speak English. Chris, with a resentful tone, asked why I didn't highlight such a skill. If he had the same skill, he would brag about it. That's the difference between us. I didn't owe him an explanation. More pressing was the negotiation. If things continued like this, it was bound to fall apart. I heard Chris growling and grinding his teeth as he spoke. He said he'd step down and tell his father, who's the president. I asked him to put his father on speakerphone and explain why he tried to remove me from the negotiation. When Chris started speaking, I knew I'd won. The negotiation was successfully concluded. I arrived at the hotel room 10 minutes late and began the negotiation. I advised Chris to avoid speaking English for those 10 minutes. Amusingly, he had memorized the Arabic phrase, "Mark will be here soon," and kept repeating it. David had booked me a room on another floor, anticipating this situation. Although I could have arrived on time, David suggested arriving late to teach Chris a lesson. Americans are often late, so I joked about it. Discussing time differences between Arabs and Americans helped the conversation flow smoothly. Once the conversation became enjoyable, the contract was practically signed. After seeing off our guests, I took a deep breath. Chris, who had been frozen in the corner, slumped into a chair, exhausted from the tension. John thanked me and apologized for Chris's behavior. He said they'd impose disciplinary actions on Chris. Chris fell silent under John's glare. John mentioned discussing the disciplinary actions when we returned to the office. Back at the office, David, who had been called to the president's office, smiled when he saw me. "Everything went well, judging by your expression," he said. "Was the hotel comfortable?" "Thanks to you, I slept very well," I replied, seeing John's puzzled look. David laughed and explained, "Chris told Mark he was either going to be promoted or demoted. We couldn't lose him, so we needed you to understand his misconduct. We asked him to help expose the company's issues." I added, "If I had reported Chris's actions myself, you'd have been skeptical, even when David told you, you didn't take it seriously." John looked embarrassed. "You're right. I apologize. We had to corner Chris to get him to confess." John turned and shouted at Chris, "I took you in when you had nowhere else to go, and this is how you repay me? It's like being bitten by my own dog. Write your resignation letter today, but you can stay until you find another job." John's glare made Chris tremble. "If you don't want to resign, you can be fired. You had no problem threatening Mark with the same choice." Chris quickly agreed, "Okay, I'll write it." I struggled to suppress my laughter as Chris rushed to HR. His resignation was processed immediately. At the next week's morning meeting, John detailed Chris's misdeeds and announced that those who aided him would face consequences. Those who had reluctantly helped Chris were transferred to lesser positions, and some resigned under scrutiny. The company's hiring approach shifted, bringing in individuals in their 30s and 40s, which proved to be a positive change. This allowed young employees who had previously felt constrained to thrive. Removing Chris from the equation revitalized the company. However, Chris now struggles to find a job, facing the consequences of his past actions. While understanding the need for decisive measures, John was curious about why I had kept my ability to speak 7 languages a secret, as it could be a valuable asset in job searching. I chuckled and explained that, for me, it had been more of a hindrance than a benefit. Throughout my student years, I had developed a deep passion for languages, becoming fluent in 7 by the time I graduated. I initially used this skill to secure a job after graduation but soon found myself confined to interpretation and translation tasks. Despite my desire to take on more involved roles in negotiations, I was restricted to merely interpreting conversations for the executives. Even when I knew how to improve a deal, I was not allowed to voice my opinions. Frustrated, I requested a transfer, but my superior denied it, stating that an interpreter only needs a functioning mouth, not necessarily intelligence. They whispered about me when I wasn't around and criticized me whenever I stumbled. Although I was summoned to key discussions, they mistakenly believed I was receiving special treatment, which made them resentful. I realized that staying would have been disastrous, so I left. This pattern repeated itself at the next 2 companies I worked for. I was taken advantage of, faced jealousy, and experienced resentment. To avoid this, I decided to downplay my language abilities during the interview process at the 4th company. David saw through that immediately. Mark shared how the companies crumbled after his departure, driven by jealousy and extreme actions. The situation with EVP Chris was a prime example. Fearing our company might face a similar fate if we pushed Mark out, we collaborated on a drastic solution. John expressed his gratitude, saying, "Thank you for your dedication to the company, and thank you, Mark. I'll repay you both someday." He shook our hands firmly. John kept his promise. The following year, David became the president and John advanced to the role of chairman. David served as the interim president until the issues were cleared, and he was highly satisfied with the outcome. I was also promoted from sales manager to executive vice president. However, since I still manage the sales department, the hectic business pace remains unchanged. My current focus is to develop reliable subordinates to share the workload. Utilizing my linguistic abilities, I refuse to limit their application solely for expedience. I firmly uphold the responsibility of those in positions of authority to nurture the development of diverse talents, and I conscientiously apply this principle in the execution of my daily duties.